Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part 2 of our second video here on the Civil War. So if you haven't watched part 1, please make sure you go check that out, because we're going to be building off of that knowledge in this second portion of the video. So looking again at the war in the East, we talked about how there was a lot more Union success in the western part of the Civil War as opposed to the eastern part. And so we're going to highlight some battles here, like the 7 Days War. We'll talk about Antietam, and we're going to talk about kind of this string of, victories early on for the Confederacy. Antietam's going to certainly be a Union victory, but we're going to see, especially on the road to Gettysburg, that neither side, again, is going to really have fully the advantage in the war. So let's dive in a little bit more to some of these early battles. So again, we're looking at being able to describe why neither the Union nor the Confederacy really gained a strong advantage during the early part of the Civil War. So the war in the East, like we mentioned, it wasn't as successful for the Union. Like we mentioned in the last video, we talked a lot about the success that Grant had had west and capturing the Mississippi River. And so certainly that portion of the Anaconda Plan was quite successful. Quite successful. We talked about how the blockade as well was also fairly successful. It cut trade by about 2/3, which is still very significant. But the last part, which would be capturing Richmond, that didn't happen yet. So far, that part of the Anaconda Plan not working. And so the South strategy, which you guys will remember from the first video of the Civil War, where they're trying to make the North tired of fighting, in many ways seems to be working. And so kind of moving forward, the Confederacy is having some success when it comes to kind of a war, of just holding out long enough. McClellan, who again, you'll remember, he's the general of the Army of the Potomac, so the army in the eastern portion of the Civil War, he didn't act very promptly on Lincoln's orders. One of the things you'll notice about Lincoln in this war is that because of the telegraph, he's able to talk in real time pretty quickly with his generals, and he's not afraid to give direct orders as commander-in-chief. And so his orders to advance directly to Richmond aren't acted upon by McClellan. This is kind of the beginning of a tough relationship between these two. Instead, McClellan decides to take his troops by ship on a several-week kind of circular route known as the Peninsular Campaign to a peninsula between the York and the James Rivers just southeast of Richmond. And so in many ways kind of define his commander-in-chief here, and in some ways making it more challenging for him to ultimately win. And so here's where we get into the war in the East. When the Union and the Confederacy troops finally do meet in June, and again, when we're looking at our timeline here, we're looking at the 7 Days War, so we're talking about 1862, so June 25th to July 1st. You're going to see that the Confederate forces, they finally meet in what is known again as the 7 Days Battle. And the Confederate general, Joseph E. Johnston, is going to be wounded during this battle. And so you're going to have Robert E. Lee take command of the Confederate forces. And he's eventually able to drive the Yankees back to the James River. And so winning kind of an important especially defensive battle to defend Richmond. And really a lot of these Confederate victories in the East are due in large part to that superior military leadership, and largely the leadership of two men, that being Robert E. Lee and then Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Those two are going to prove. And so when we were talking about the advantages in that first video, we talked about the military leadership probably being the most important to the Confederacy. You're starting to see that in this early part of the war. And so some of those early victories include the 7 Days Battle, the Second Battle of Bull Run. And again, that's the second one because we talked about the first one in the last video. Fredericksburg, and then Chancellorsville. And so putting together this string of victories is going to be really great for the Confederates' morale and also certainly push them to be more aggressive. And so the Confederacy wants to capture D.C., and this is part of them wanting to be more aggressive in the fighting and take more of it to the Union now that they've had some victories, especially in the East. So Jefferson Davis, remember, president of the Confederacy, he's going to encourage Robert E. Lee to attack the North in the North. And so Lee wants to try to confuse McClellan by splitting his army into 4 different pieces. However, McClellan's able to obtain a copy of those orders, but before that, there's another major battle, the Battle of Antietam, which occurs on September 17th, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. And this battle will be a narrow victory for the Union, but it's going to come at a very high cost for both sides. And so quite a force is engaged here, over 132,000, 87 of which were Union, 45,000 which were Confederate. And this is going to end up being the bloodiest and have the most American death on any single day in American history, which even when this video is being recorded during the COVID-19 pandemic, that's still true. And again, we're filming this in February of 2021. So certainly when we look at it, a massive amount of forces being engaged here, but also certainly high casualties. And in some cases, many of these bodies couldn't be collected for a couple of days. Both armies are going to suffer severe losses on that day, September 17th, 1862. And again, it's the bloodiest day of the Civil War. And like I said, it's got the most American deaths of any day in U.S. history to this point. But neither one is fully destroyed. And so it should be noted that, again, despite the enormous amount of casualties, so total number of casualties is over 22,000. It's 22,717, with the Union accounting for the slight majority of that, the 12,401, as compared to the 10,310. But 2,108 soldiers were killed on the Union side, and 1,546 soldiers were killed on the Confederate side, with an enormous amount wounded, you guys can see here from the numbers, as well as the missing and captured, both being pretty high in this particular battle as well. The next day, Lee did withdraw to Virginia after this particular battle, so the Union did claim victory. However, Lincoln wants McClellan to go and pursue Lee into Virginia. McClellan doesn't think this is a good idea, and so he refuses to do it. Well, that's kind of the final straw with Lincoln, and so Lincoln replaces him with the impressively bearded Ambrose Burnside, who again is very well known for his facial hair. In fact, the facial hair that he's rocking in that picture is actually today known as the Burnside. And so he takes over as the commander of the Army of the Potomac, or the Army in the East. And so Lincoln wants to use the strategic victory to try to change the North's aims in this war. And so it kind of shifts from the war being about preserving the Union to now being a war against slavery. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but the North's original goal, again, was to preserve the Union, not to destroy slavery. And Lincoln's hesitant to do this for a variety of different reasons. Among them, remember, one of his chief goals is to try to keep those border states in the Union. And those are states that have slavery in them, and that is where they supported slavery in the majority. He also doesn't want to divide the people, and he doesn't want to make this war less popular. Remember that one of the advantages that the Confederacy has is that more people supported their cause than they did in the Union, and he's afraid of that. However, he notices that many Northerners thought that slavery was in some ways helping the efforts of the Confederacy or helping the efforts of the South. And so he makes this decision to make it more of a moral war, one against slavery. And so he takes some actions in order to do this. Most famously, on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And basically, it said that all persons held as slaves within any state, key part of this is, in rebellion against the United States. So those border states that we brought up earlier, slavery is still legal there. Shall then, thenceforward, and forever be free. Now, looking at this on its face value, this is often considered one of Lincoln's greatest accomplishments and one of his greatest actions. But we have to keep in mind that it didn't really free anybody. Because remember, Lincoln doesn't have any power to free slaves in the Confederacy because he's not the president of the Confederacy. That's Jefferson Davis. And so, in many ways, this is a military strategy because it's essentially saying to African Americans in the Confederacy, if you can make your way to the North, you can come join the Army, and you can come join the Army and fight against slavery. And so in some ways, the proclamation had the important impact of officially stating that the government's position on slavery was against slavery and that it needed to end. So it sends a pretty clear message, not only to African Americans, but also certainly to the Confederacy as well. It also certainly creates the opportunity to create African American military units. And so you're going to see the first African American units join the Civil War after the Emancipation Proclamation. So like I said, in many ways, it's a military tactic, a little bit more than it was freeing the slaves. That comes with the 13th Amendment. But probably what also deals a bigger blow to the Confederacy is that now Europe, who strongly opposed slavery, they're not going to want to defend the South. And so they're going to probably go somewhere else to buy their cotton. And in particular, one of the places they go is to Egypt and to India. Now, Frederick Douglass, you'll remember, abolitionist leader, he's a close advisor to Lincoln. And in many ways, he helps to convince Lincoln to make the war about slavery. And he said, the white man's happiness cannot be purchased on the black man's misery. And so he's in many ways able to help convince Lincoln that this needs to be the new focus of the Civil War. And so helping to, in many ways, push the Emancipation Proclamation forward. So now you're going to have runaway slaves make their way to the Union. They're going to join the Union Army and they're going to fight for the Union's cause because now they can fight to end slavery. They can go and fight to end and hopefully free some of the people that they were, enslaved with. It's a new fighting force, so it even adds to that number of advantage for the Union as far as the total numbers. And then lastly, it also takes away soldiers from the Union or from the Confederacy. And so in a lot of ways, this is really a pretty smart military move by Lincoln because it does open up a whole lot of change as we get into the latter part of the Civil War. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up this edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History and the second portion, the second video here in our discussion on the Civil War. So for my students, make sure you've been following along with the guided notes. Ask me any questions that you have. For anybody who's just listening, I appreciate you listening to both part 1 and part 2. And hopefully you're starting to gain a little bit of understanding of the story that makes up the American Civil War. Have a great day, everyone.